Hi, I'm meteorologist Paul Dorian here on Tuesday, January 31st. Spring fever alert here in the Mid-Atlantic region for the next couple of days. Temperatures will soar through the 50s both today and tomorrow, reaching 60 degrees in many spots of the Mid-Atlantic region. Of course, we've been very mild here for much of the winter here in the eastern part of the U.S. December was well above normal. January was well above normal. Meanwhile, Alaska has suffered through one of its coldest Januaries ever. In fact, it looks like this January will go down as one of the top 10 coldest Januaries ever. Fairbanks, Alaska bottomed out at minus 51 degrees early Sunday morning, some 35 degrees below the normal for that morning low temperature on Sunday. There's also an unofficial report of a minus 79 degrees a couple of mornings ago at Prospect Creek, Alaska. That is only a degree or two off the all-time U.S. low temperature record. So that cold air has been bottled up over Alaska and northwestern Canada over the next several weeks. There are strong signs, however, that a pattern change will evolve over the next week to 10 days that could very well bring some of that cold air that's been stuck up there in northwestern Canada down into the central and eastern part of the U.S. later next week. Well, let's take a look at what's called the PNA, or Pacific North American Index here. We've looked at many indexes here at the SIweather.com, including the North Atlantic Oscillation, for example, the NAO, which gives us an idea of the circulation pattern or the pressures and temperatures in the North Atlantic. Well, this particular index, called the PNA, gives us an idea of what's going on over the North Pacific, and it has an effect on circulation patterns over the western part of North America. You notice right here, this is the actual current PNA reading, and it's quite positive. This is the neutral line or zero line right here. And this actually is the most positive it's been since for the last several weeks. You see here, right here, and it's actually higher than the PNA has been right through this whole time period, all the way back into October. And it's forecasted to stay relatively positive over the next several days. Now, typically, with a strong positive PNA, you get a pattern where a strong ridge develops in the western part of the North American continent. Here's a figure that kind of depicts what goes on in the atmosphere in terms of pressure with a positive PNA. You have this high pressure or ridge developing along the western part of the North American continent, and ultimately a trough can set up here in the eastern part of the continent. And what that leads to is a wind flow that flows down around the top of the high pressure ridge down into the central part of the U.S. and then into the eastern part of the U.S. In other words, cold air that is bottled up over Alaska, northwestern Canada, now has a possibility of sliding south and eastward into the central part of the U.S. And this is what looks like very well could happen over the next week to 10 days. Again, this is just a generic, a typical positive PNA pattern. Now let's take a look at the current situation. These next series of charts are off of the Penn State EWAL site, and what they're showing is the GFS ensemble run from last night, the 00 GFS ensemble run. That's a series of GFS runs with slightly different input parameters, and it gives you a higher confidence than just seeing one operational run. Anyway, this is the GFS ensemble run for tomorrow, Wednesday morning, at 500 millibars, the middle part of the atmosphere, and the colors kind of represent the anomalies where it's colder than normal or lower heights compared to normal. The oranges, warmer than normal or higher heights compared to normal. And the first thing I want to point out is in the current situation right now, for at least for the next 24 hours or so, the basic flow and the wind flow kind of follows these lines here. It's kind of west to east across the northern part of Canada. In other words, all this cold air over Alaska and northwestern Canada is still bottled up over the next couple of days with this kind of a flow pattern here. It's basically cut off from dropping southeast into the continental U.S. Here's the north-central part of the U.S. here in the Mid-Atlantic region right in here. So this basic wind flow that follows these contours right here is kind of cutting off the Arctic air, at least for the next couple of days. Well, now we're looking ahead to next Wednesday, a week from tomorrow, according to the last night's GFS ensemble run at 500 millibars, the all-important part of the atmosphere where the wind currents steer surface systems. Now notice what happens here. We have this really tremendous ridge building up here in the western part of North America, and now the wind flow is actually dropping around this ridge all the way from the northwestern part of Canada into the central part of the U.S. and then finally into the eastern part of the U.S. In other words, it's a rather typical looking positive PNA pattern that develops here over the next week to 10 days. And that very well could allow for this cold, brutal cold air that's been bottled up over Alaska and northwestern Canada, at least part of that air mass, to slide down southeastward following these contours into the central part of the U.S. and ultimately into the eastern part of the U.S. So again, we're looking ahead a week to 10 days or so. This is from the GFS model. Let's jump ahead a couple more days. This is a couple more days down the road for next Friday, a week from this Friday, and the pattern still pretty much is in existence here with this strong ridge up across the western part of North America and flow of air from way up at the top of the world down into the central part of the U.S., into the eastern part of the U.S., even some hints of a cross-polar flow that crosses the North Pole. On the other side of the pole comes across the pole and down into the central part of Canada and ultimately into the U.S. So you have your typical positive PNA pattern that appears to be in stages of development for about a week to 10 days away. Now, not to be outdone, let's take a look at the European model. Well, here's the European model forecast for about 7 to 10 days out. Again, the middle to latter part of next week. And like the GFS, it has a strong ridge developing here with this strong positive PNA pattern, this ridge developing across North America. And meanwhile, the flow of air is from way up there in northwest Canada down into the central and eastern part of the U.S. with a couple of troughs developing, one here in the eastern part of the U.S. and one way out here over the Pacific. So it looks like both models, the European and GFS model, are giving us strong indications of a much colder weather pattern developing later next week. So we'll continue to monitor that over the next few days. The next 2 days will be well above normal, but again, there are strong signs of much colder weather later next week. That's it for now for the SIweather.com. I'm meteorologist Paul Dorian.